London, 1823. The rain had started before dawn, and by the time Isolder Marin descended the servants' staircase with an armful of fresh linens, the March sky hung grey and swollen over the sprawling grounds of Alderbury Manor. She moved through the corridors with the practiced silence of someone who had learned long ago that invisibility was not merely an art, but a necessity. The marble floors gleamed beneath her worn boots, reflecting the pallid light that filtered through the tall windows, and she could hear the distant murmur of voices from the drawing room, where Lady Seraphina was no doubt orchestrating yet another elaborate scheme to secure advantageous matches for her daughters. Isolder was 29 years old, though she felt both younger and infinitely older depending on the hour. She had arrived at Alderbury Manor at 12, orphaned and bewildered, clutching a single carpet bag that contained everything she owned in the world. Her father had been a minor gentleman with a modest estate that had crumbled beneath debts he'd hidden even from his wife. When fever took both her parents within a week of each other, distant cousin Seraphina had offered to take her in. Not out of familial warmth, Isolder understood even then, but because refusing would have looked poorly among their social circle. The arrangement had been made clear from the beginning. Isolder was not to be treated as family. She would earn her keep by assisting the household staff, and she would be grateful for the roof over her head and the food on her plate. Mrs. Wickham, the stern but not unkind housekeeper, had taken Isolder under her wing, teaching her the intricate choreography of running a great house. Over the years, Isolder had become indispensable in ways that Lady Seraphina never acknowledged, but certainly exploited. She had watched Seraphina's daughters, Clarissa and Vivienne, grow from sullen children into beautiful young women who moved through the world with the careless confidence of those who had never known want. Clarissa, at 23, possessed her mother's calculating nature wrapped in an exterior of porcelain prettiness. Vivienne, 2 years younger, was softer but no less ambitious, her sweetness a carefully cultivated tool. Both were accomplished in all the arts required of young ladies of quality. They could paint watercolors that were adequate if uninspired, play the pianoforte with mechanical precision, and converse in French with acceptable pronunciation. Lord Alistair Greythorne, the man Seraphina had married 3 years after Isolder's arrival, was a study in ambition masked as propriety. He had coveted the Alderbury name and fortune, and Seraphina had coveted his title of Earl. Together they had formed an alliance rather than a marriage, and they pursued their goals with ruthless efficiency. Their primary objective now was to marry both daughters into families of significant influence, preferably before the season ended. Isolder had long since made peace with her position. She told herself she was content in her shadow life, moving through the grand rooms like a ghost, observing but never participating. She had her books, smuggled from the library in quiet hours. She had her walks through the kitchen gardens when her duties permitted. She had learned to find satisfaction in small things: the perfect fold of a linen, the gleam of polished silver, the first snowdrops pushing through frozen ground in late winter. But sometimes in the darkest hours of night, when sleep eluded her in her small attic room, she allowed herself to acknowledge the hollow ache that lived beneath her ribs. She was neither servant nor family, neither fish nor fowl, existing in a liminal space that offered safety but no belonging. She had learned not to want more, or at least to bury those wants so deep they rarely surfaced. The drawing-room doors were closed when she passed, but she could hear Lady Seraphina's voice rising in pitch, a sure sign of agitation. Isolder quickened her pace. She had deliveries to manage in the kitchen, and cook had mentioned they needed to discuss the menu for the dinner party planned for later in the week. Apparently, Lady Seraphina had invited several eligible gentlemen and their families, another tactical strike in her campaign to secure her daughters' futures. Mrs. Wickham met her at the bottom of the servants' stairs, her grey hair pulled back in its customary severe bun, her expression betraying nothing. But Isolder had learned to read the tiny signs, the slight tightness around the housekeeper's mouth, the way her fingers worried at her chatelaine of keys. "There's been a change of plans," Mrs. Wickham said without preamble. "Her ladyship has just received word that the Duke of Ravenshire will be attending the dinner party Thursday next." Isolder's hands tightened on the linens. The Duke of Ravenshire. Even she, sequestered as she was from society, knew that name. Dorian Ashford, 6th Duke of Ravenshire, was one of the most powerful men in England. His family's influence stretched back centuries. Their wealth was legendary, and the Duke himself had a reputation that sparked equal parts admiration and wariness. He was known for his sharp intellect, his patronage of progressive causes that made traditional lords uncomfortable, and his refusal to play by the expected social rules despite his elevated position. "I see," Isolder said carefully. "I imagine Lady Seraphina is quite excited." Mrs. Wickham's expression flickered with something that might have been wry humour. "Excited is one word for it. She's currently rewriting the guest list, the seating arrangements, and has demanded the entire menu be reconsidered. She wants everything to be perfect." The housekeeper paused, her sharp eyes studying Isolder. "There's more. His Grace is arriving this afternoon. He's travelling through the area and has accepted Lord Greythorne's invitation to stay at the manor for the week leading up to the dinner party." This was unexpected. Dukes of Ravenshire's stature didn't typically accept week-long stays at the homes of earls, even ambitious ones. There must be some connection Isolder wasn't aware of, some political or business arrangement that made the visit worthwhile for both parties. "We'll need to prepare the blue suite," Mrs. Wickham continued. "His Grace is travelling with his valet and secretary. They'll need rooms as well. And Isolder—" The housekeeper's voice dropped lower. "Her ladyship has given explicit instructions. She wants you to remain out of sight as much as possible during His Grace's stay. No serving at table, no appearing in the public rooms. She says she doesn't want any distractions from her daughters." The words shouldn't have stung. They were nothing Isolder hadn't heard before in various forms, but somehow, this time, they burrowed deeper. A distraction. As if her very existence was something shameful, something to be hidden away like a crooked painting or a tarnished candlestick. "I understand," Isolder said, keeping her voice level. "I'll make sure everything is perfect for His Grace's arrival." Mrs. Wickham's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You always do, dear. Now let's get to work. We have only a few hours." The afternoon passed in a whirlwind of preparation. The blue suite, typically reserved for the most distinguished guests, was aired and polished until every surface gleamed. Fresh flowers were arranged in crystal vases. The finest linens were placed on the bed. Isolder supervised it all, her hands moving with efficient grace, her mind occupied with logistics rather than the peculiar tightness that had settled in her chest. She was in the library, selecting a few current newspapers and journals to place in His Grace's room. Mrs. Wickham had mentioned the Duke was known for his voracious reading when she heard the commotion of arrival. Horses, the clatter of carriage wheels on gravel, the sudden animation of voices. Isolder moved to the window, staying behind the heavy curtain where she couldn't be seen, and looked down at the front drive. 3 carriages had arrived, elegant and well-appointed, bearing the Ravenshire coat of arms on their doors. Footmen and grooms bustled about with luggage. Lord Greythorne and Lady Seraphina stood at the entrance, flanked by Clarissa and Vivian, both dressed in their finest day gowns, their faces arranged in expressions of demure welcome. Then a man stepped down from the first carriage, and even from her elevated vantage point, Isolder felt something shift in the air. The Duke of Ravenshire was not what she had expected. She had imagined someone older, perhaps portly, with the self-satisfied bearing of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. Instead, the man who now stood in the drive was perhaps in his early 30s, tall and lean, with dark hair that fell across his forehead, despite obvious attempts to tame it. He moved with an economy of motion that suggested both physical capability and mental discipline. Even at this distance, there was something compelling about him, something that drew the eye and held it. He greeted Lord Greythorne with perfect courtesy, bowed over Lady Seraphina's hand with appropriate deference, and acknowledged Clarissa and Vivian with polite attention. But there was something in his manner, something in the way he held himself, that suggested he was observing as much as being observed. It was the posture of someone accustomed to seeing beneath surfaces, someone who looked for truth rather than accepting performance. Isolder watched as the party moved inside, the Duke's deep voice carrying faintly through the open door. Then they were gone, swept into the formal rituals of welcome, and she was left standing in the library with her armful of newspapers, feeling oddly unmoored. She shook herself mentally. This was foolishness. The Duke of Ravenshire's arrival changed nothing about her circumstances. She would remain invisible as instructed, would continue her work, and in a week's time he would leave and life would return to its familiar patterns. The strange flutter in her chest was merely the household's excitement manifesting in her own response. Nothing more. Isolder finished her task in the library and made her way back through the servants' corridors toward the kitchen. She could hear the household coming alive around her, maids hurrying with extra coal for fires, footmen carrying trunks up the main stairs, cook's voice raised in the kitchen as she amended dinner plans. Everyone was in motion, the great machine of the household adjusting itself to accommodate this important guest. That evening, Isolder took her dinner in the servants' hall as always, listening to the chatter around her. The Duke's valet, Mr. Pemberton, was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a discretion that spoke of long service. He shared little about his employer beyond confirming that His Grace preferred strong tea in the morning, worked late into the night, and had a particular dislike of pomposity in any form. "He's a good master," Pemberton said simply. "Fair, expects much but gives much in return. He's got no patience for foolishness, but he's generous to those who serve him well." This brief character sketch intrigued Isolder more than she wanted to admit. She had known enough of the nobility to understand that true fairness and genuine generosity were far rarer qualities than they should be. A duke who possessed both was remarkable indeed. That night, lying in her narrow bed under the eaves, Isolder found herself thinking about the brief glimpse she'd had of the duke. There had been something in his bearing, something she couldn't quite name, that lingered in her mind. She told herself it was simply curiosity about someone so far removed from her own circumstances. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself many things, but sleep was slow to come. The next 3 days passed in a strange duality. Isolder maintained her usual routines, working alongside Mrs. Wickham and the other staff, but she was hyper-aware of the Duke's presence in the house. She knew his schedule without meaning to. Early rides before breakfast, long hours in Lord Greythorn's study discussing what she imagined were matters of business or politics, dinners that stretched late into the evening with the family. She heard reports from the other servants. The Duke was unfailingly courteous. He thanked people by name. He had helped a young footman who'd stumbled with a tea tray, catching a cup before it fell, and making a joke that put the mortified boy at ease. Isolder found herself wondering what it would be like to be in the same room with him, to hear his voice directly rather than as a distant murmur through walls and floors. She chastised herself for the thought. Such wondering was pointless and potentially dangerous. She was invisible, and invisible she would remain. On the 4th evening of the Duke's stay, Isolder was in the still room, checking the inventory of preserves and dried herbs, when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. She paid them no mind at first. Servants were constantly moving through these back areas. But then the door opened, and she looked up to find herself face to face with the Duke of Ravensshire himself. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Isolder's first coherent thought was that he was more striking up close than he had been from a distance. His eyes were a startling grey-blue, the colour of a winter sky before snow. His face was all strong lines and sharp angles, but there was intelligence and humour in it as well, a suggestion of depths that went beyond the aristocratic handsomeness. The Duke appeared equally surprised to find someone in the still room. His gaze travelled over her, taking in her simple grey dress, her work-roughened hands, her hair pulled back in a practical bun. Isolder felt exposed under that scrutiny, as if those keen eyes could see through the careful armour of invisibility she'd constructed over the years. "I beg your pardon," the Duke said, his voice a pleasant baritone that seemed to resonate in the small space. "I was attempting to find the library and appear to have taken a wrong turn. These servants' corridors are rather labyrinthine." Isolder found her voice, though it came out softer than intended. "The library is on the 2nd floor, Your Grace. You've come down rather than up." A rueful smile crossed his face. "So I have. I pride myself on my sense of direction, but this house has defeated me thoroughly." He studied her for another moment. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Dorian Ashford." She knew who he was, of course, but his use of his given name rather than his title caught her off guard. "Isolder Maren, Your Grace. I assist Mrs. Wickham with managing the household. Isolde. He spoke her name as if testing its weight, its sound. That's an unusual name, beautiful. Heat crept up her neck. She wasn't accustomed to compliments, certainly not from dukes. It was my grandmother's name, Your Grace. You have the advantage of me, Miss Marin. You know to address me as Your Grace, but I find myself uncertain of your precise position in this household. Are you family or staff? Your speech and bearing suggest the former, yet your dress and location suggest the latter. The question was asked without judgment, genuine curiosity evident in his tone. Still, it touched on the wound that never quite healed, the wound of belonging nowhere fully. I'm Lady Seraphina's cousin, Your Grace. My parents died when I was young, and she was kind enough to take me in. I earn my keep by assisting with the household management. Something flickered in those grey-blue eyes, something that looked almost like recognition or understanding. I see. That must be a rather complicated position. I'm grateful for it, Your Grace. Gratitude and complexity aren't mutually exclusive, Miss Marin. He moved slightly further into the room, glancing at the shelves lined with jars and bottles. What is this place? It smells of summer despite the late winter chill outside. The still room, Your Grace. We make preserves, cordials, and medicinal preparations here. The scent is probably the lavender sachets we prepared last week. Remarkable. I had no idea such places existed in modern households. It seems charmingly medieval. He picked up one of the sachets, inhaling its scent. My grandmother had a room like this at Ravenshire. I remember spending hours there as a boy watching her work. She said the old ways were often the best ways, that one shouldn't discard tradition simply because something was new. Isolde found herself relaxing slightly. There was something approachable about him despite his rank, something that invited conversation rather than stilted formality. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman, Your Grace. She was, sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous if you crossed her. His smile was warm with memory. She also had very particular views about the duties of our class. She believed that privilege came with responsibility, that those of us fortunate enough to be born into wealth and power had an obligation to use them well. I try to live by her principles, though I'm certain I fall short more often than not. This confession, so honest and unguarded, surprised Isolde. In her experience, the nobility rarely acknowledged any shortcomings, rarely suggested they might be anything less than perfectly suited to their elevated positions. I think the attempt itself is admirable, Your Grace. Do you? He looked at her intently. Most of my peers think I'm mad. They believe my support for parliamentary reform and my insistence on improving conditions for my tenants and workers is naive at best, dangerous at worst. They think I'm trying to dismantle the natural order. Perhaps the natural order requires some dismantling, Your Grace. The words were out before she could stop them, bold to the point of impropriety. Isolde felt her face flush. She had no right to express such opinions, certainly not to a duke she'd just met. But instead of taking offense, the duke laughed, a genuine, delighted sound. Now that is refreshing. I can't tell you how tired I am of people telling me what they think I want to hear, rather than what they actually believe. Tell me, Miss Marin, do you often express such radical views? No, Your Grace. That was extraordinarily presumptuous of me. I apologize. Don't. His voice was firm. Don't apologize for speaking your mind. It's one of the rarest and most valuable traits a person can possess. He paused, studying her again with that penetrating gaze. How long have you lived here, Miss Marin? 17 years, Your Grace. 17 years. You would have been quite young when you arrived. 12, Your Grace. Something shifted in his expression, a shadow crossing his features. 12. The age when one is neither child nor adult, when the world begins to reveal its harsher truths. He set down the lavender sachet with careful precision. And in 17 years, have you been happy here? The question was impossible to answer honestly without betraying the family that housed her, without revealing the complicated tangle of gratitude, resentment, resignation, and loneliness that characterized her life at Alderbury Manor. So she gave the safe answer, the expected answer. I'm grateful for Lady Seraphina's kindness, Your Grace. That's the second time you've mentioned gratitude, the Duke observed quietly. But you haven't mentioned happiness. Before Isolder could formulate a response that was both truthful and appropriate, the door burst open and Lady Seraphina swept in, her face flushed with obvious agitation. Her eyes went wide when she saw the Duke, then narrowed dangerously when they landed on Isolder. "Your Grace, I've been looking everywhere for you. Whatever are you doing in the still room?" Lady Seraphina's voice was honey-sweet, but Isolder could hear the steel beneath it. "I'm afraid I got thoroughly lost trying to find the library," the Duke said smoothly. "Miss Maron was kind enough to redirect me. She was also explaining the fascinating work that happens in this room. I had no idea households still maintained such traditional practices." "Oh, well, yes, some of the old ways persist." Lady Seraphina waved a dismissive hand. "But surely such things are of little interest to someone of your stature, Your Grace. Do come. We're gathering in the drawing room for tea, and Clarissa is preparing to play for us. She's quite accomplished on the pianoforte." "I'm certain she is." The Duke's tone was perfectly polite, perfectly neutral. He turned to Isolder and offered a slight bow. "Thank you for the enlightening conversation, Miss Maron, and for the directions, of course." "Of course, Your Grace." Isolder curtsied, keeping her eyes down. As Lady Seraphina guided the Duke out, Isolder heard her say, "I do apologize that Isolder imposed on your time, Your Grace. She should know better than to waylay guests. I'll speak to her about it." The Duke's response was too quiet for Isolder to hear, but something in his tone made Lady Seraphina fall silent. Then they were gone, and Isolder was left alone in the still room, her heart pounding inexplicably hard. She should have felt embarrassed or worried about Lady Seraphina's displeasure. Instead, she felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. The Duke had spoken to her as if she were a person worth speaking to, as if her thoughts and words mattered. He had looked at her, truly looked at her, and seen something beyond the invisible servant-cousin hybrid she'd become. It was dangerous, this feeling, dangerous and foolish, but as Isolder returned to her inventory, her hands moving automatically through familiar tasks, she couldn't quite suppress the warmth that had taken up residence in her chest. That night, lying in her attic room, Isolder replayed every moment of the conversation. The way the Duke had smiled when she'd suggested the natural order required dismantling, the genuine interest in his questions, the shadow that had crossed his face when she'd mentioned arriving at Alderbury at 12 years old, the careful precision with which he'd set down the lavender sachet, as if even such a small object deserved respect and care. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself he'd been merely polite, that he probably made everyone feel interesting and valued, because that was a skill men of his position cultivated. She told herself to forget it, to return to her carefully constructed invisibility. But memory, Isolder was learning, didn't obey instructions. The following day brought an unexpected development. Isolder was working in the morning room, replacing candles and ensuring the fire was properly laid, when Mrs. Wickham found her. "His Grace has made a request," the housekeeper said, her expression unreadable. "He wishes to have breakfast in the conservatory tomorrow morning, rather than with the family in the dining room. He's asked specifically if you might serve him, as he has some questions about the house's history and management that he believes you could answer." Isolder stared at her. "Me? Why would His Grace—" "I couldn't say," Mrs. Wickham interrupted, though her shrewd eyes suggested she could say quite a lot if she chose. "But it's a direct request from a duke, which means we accommodate it." Lady Seraphina wasn't pleased, but Lord Greythorne overruled her objections. "You'll serve His Grace breakfast in the conservatory at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning." The rest of the day passed in a haze of nervous anticipation. Isolder went through her duties mechanically, her mind circling constantly around the upcoming breakfast. What could the Duke possibly want to ask her? What questions about the house's history and management required her specific input? And why had he requested her presence when doing so had clearly caused friction with Lady Seraphina? She spent extra time that evening ensuring her one good dress, a simple but well-made garment in deep blue, was pressed and presentable. She washed her hair and spent longer than usual pinning it up, then felt foolish for taking such care. This was a breakfast service, nothing more. The Duke probably had some mundane question about household accounts or staffing that he felt more comfortable discussing with someone outside the family. Still, when she descended the stairs the next morning at 6:45, her hands were trembling slightly. The conservatory was one of Isolder's favourite places in the entire manor. Built onto the south side of the house, it was a room of glass and light, filled with exotic plants that Lord Greythorne's father had collected during his travels. In the grey dampness of late winter, it offered a hint of spring, a promise that cold and darkness weren't eternal. Isolder had arranged a small table near the windows overlooking the garden. She'd brought fresh pastries from the kitchen, along with eggs, ham, fruit, and the strong tea Mr. Pemberton had mentioned the Duke preferred. Everything was perfect, waiting only for His Grace himself. He arrived precisely at 7, dressed simply in riding clothes, his dark hair slightly damp as if he'd already been out in the morning air. When he saw the table, he smiled. "This is perfect, Miss Maren, thank you." He gestured to the second chair. "Please sit. I wasn't joking about having questions, but I also find eating alone to be one of life's more melancholy activities." Isolder hesitated. "Your Grace, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to dine with you. Perhaps not by the arbitrary rules of society, but by the rules of basic human courtesy. It would be far more inappropriate for me to make you stand there watching me eat." He pulled out the chair for her. "Please, I've had quite enough of artificial propriety this week." Slowly, feeling as if she were stepping into a dream, or possibly a trap, Isolder sat. The Duke took the seat across from her, and began serving himself with no apparent expectation that she should do it for him. "Now," he said, once he'd poured tea for both of them, "I should be honest with you, Miss Maren. I did have questions about the house's management, and I'll ask them because I'm genuinely curious. But the primary reason I requested your presence this morning is that I wanted to speak with you again without Lady Seraphina's interference." Isolder's hand froze halfway to her teacup. "Your Grace? I've spent 4 days in this house," the Duke continued calmly, "and I've observed a great deal. I've watched how you move through it like a ghost, efficient and invisible. I've seen how Lady Seraphina treats you, dismissively in public, but I've also noted how often she sends servants to find you when something needs handling properly. I've observed her daughters ignoring your existence entirely, and Lord Greythorne treating you as if you're merely another piece of furniture." Heat rose in Isolder's cheeks, but it was embarrassment mixed with something else, a strange relief at being seen, truly seen after so many years of calculated invisibility. "I've also noticed," the Duke said, his voice gentler now, "how you handle every task with quiet competence, how the other servants respect you, and how you've created a life in the margins of this household. And I found myself wondering why. Why someone with your obvious intelligence and capability has allowed herself to be relegated to the shadows." "Because I have no choice, Your Grace." The words came out more sharply than intended. "I'm an orphan with no fortune, no prospects, and no connections, beyond a cousin who took me in out of obligation, rather than love. This shadow life, as you call it, is better than the alternatives available to women in my position." "Is it?" The Duke's grey-blue eyes were steady on hers. "What alternatives do you imagine you have?" "Governess, if I'm fortunate. Companion to some elderly woman. Factory work if I'm less fortunate. The workhouse if fortune abandons me entirely." Isolder set down her teacup with a sharp click. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but it's easy to question choices when you've never had to make them from a position of complete powerlessness." Instead of being offended by her bluntness, the Duke smiled, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "There you are. That's what I glimpsed in the still room. That spark, that refusal to pretend everything is acceptable when it manifestly isn't. Your Grace, I shouldn't speak to you this way." "Why not?" "Because I'm a Duke? Because society has decided that honest communication is somehow less appropriate than elaborate pretense." He leaned forward slightly. "Miss Maren, Isolder, may I call you Isolder?" She should say no. Every rule of propriety demanded she say no. "Yes, Your Grace." "And you should call me Dorian. At least here, in this conversation, let's dispense with the performance of it all." "I couldn't possibly." "You could. You're choosing not to, which is different." He took a sip of his tea. "I'm going to tell you something I don't share widely. When I was 8 years old, my father died. My mother remarried within a year to a man who viewed me as an obstacle to his own children inheriting the dukedom. For 6 years, until my majority at 14, I lived in my own home as an unwanted presence. I was fed and clothed and educated because it was required, but I was made to understand daily that I was tolerated rather than wanted. Isolder's throat tightened. I'm sorry. I tell you this not to garner sympathy, but to make clear that I understand something about living in spaces where you're not truly welcome, about constructing armor to survive hostility disguised as civility. My circumstances were different from yours. I had wealth and title to shield me eventually, but I recognize the particular posture of someone who's learned to make themselves small to survive. Why are you telling me this? Isolder whispered. Because from the moment I saw you in that still room, I recognized something of myself, and because, he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, because in 4 days of watching you move through this house, of hearing your voice, of noting your grace and competence and the intelligence you try to hide, I found myself thinking about you far more than is probably wise. The conservatory seemed suddenly too warm, too small, the air too thick to breathe properly. Isolder stared at him, certain she'd misunderstood. Your grace, Dorian. Your grace, she repeated firmly. You can't possibly be suggesting... I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply being honest about my thoughts and feelings, which is a courtesy I wish more people would extend. He sat back in his chair. You intrigue me, Isolder. Your resilience intrigues me. Your quiet strength intrigues me. And yes, I find you beautiful, though I suspect you've spent so many years being treated as invisible that you don't even realize it. Isolder stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is improper. I should return to my duties. Of course you should. That's what's expected, what's safe. The Duke, Dorian, stood as well but made no move to stop her. But before you go, answer me one question honestly. When we spoke in the still room, when I asked if you'd been happy here, you deflected. So I'll ask differently. Are you content with your life, Isolder? Truly content? No one had ever asked her that. Not in 17 years. Everyone had assumed, or pretended to assume, that she should be grateful for what she had. The question struck something deep and fundamental, and before she could stop herself, the truth emerged. No, I'm not content. I'm resigned, which is different. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, but contentment isn't something people in my position can afford to pursue. What if I told you that was a lie we've all been taught to keep the powerful in power and the powerless in place? Then I'd say you're speaking from a position of privilege that allows you the luxury of challenging such lies. Fair enough. He moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his grey eyes, close enough to smell the faint scent of sandalwood and something else, something uniquely him. But what if I also told you that privilege, properly used, can sometimes dismantle the very structures that created it? What if I told you that I have no interest in continuing a system that diminishes people like you? People like me? Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Brilliant people. Strong people. People who could reshape the world if given the opportunity, rather than being forced to hide in the margins of someone else's life. They stood there, the morning light streaming through the conservatory glass, the moment stretching into something that felt significant beyond Isolder's ability to name. Then, from somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour, breaking the spell. I should go, Isolder said, stepping back. Thank you for breakfast, Your Grace. Dorian, she didn't correct him this time, simply gathered the tea things onto a tray and fled the conservatory. Her heart pounding so hard, she was certain everyone in the house must hear it. The next 3 days were torture of a kind Isolder had never experienced. She continued her duties, continued her invisible routines, but she was hyper-aware of the Duke's presence in the house. She found herself listening for his voice in other rooms, timing her movements through the corridors to avoid crossing his path, while simultaneously hoping she might catch a glimpse of him. It was maddening, this contradiction between what she knew she should want and what she actually wanted. She told herself his words in the conservatory had been merely kindness, perhaps pity for her circumstances. Dukes didn't develop genuine interest in impoverished relations of the families they visited. Such things happened in novels, not in the harsh reality of English society in 1823. She needed to forget that conversation to return to the safety of her shadows. But forgetting proved impossible. His words echoed in her mind during the day and invaded her dreams at night. "Are you content?" The question haunted her because she'd finally admitted the answer aloud, and now she couldn't unknow that truth about herself. The household grew increasingly frantic as the dinner party approached. Lady Serafina was everywhere at once, micromanaging every detail, her anxiety manifesting as sharp criticism of everyone around her. The menu was changed 3 times. The seating arrangement was rewritten so often that Mrs. Wickham finally insisted Lady Serafina settle on something or risk complete chaos. Both Clarissa and Vivian had new gowns made, each more elaborate than the last, and the house rang with their excitement and their mother's instructions on how to comport themselves to best advantage. Isolder observed it all with a strange detachment. She'd seen this performance many times before, the careful display of accomplishment and beauty, the strategic positioning, the barely concealed desperation beneath the veneer of aristocratic confidence. Usually she felt a mix of pity and resignation watching these rituals. Now, after her conversations with Dorian, she felt something closer to anger. These women had so many more options than she did, yet they'd been taught to view marriage to a wealthy man as their only worthy goal. They'd been given education and resources and social position, but all of it was meant to funnel them toward the same narrow end. It was a gilded cage, certainly, far more comfortable than Isolder's own precarious position, but a cage nonetheless. On the evening before the dinner party, Isolder was in the small study adjacent to the library, reviewing the household accounts by candlelight, when she heard the door open. She looked up to find Dorian standing in the doorway, still dressed for dinner, his cravat slightly loosened. "I saw light under the door," he said quietly. "I hoped I might find you here." Isolder's heart lurched. They were alone again, away from the oversight of Lady Serafina or the other servants. It was dangerous and improper, and she knew she should send him away immediately. Instead, she heard herself say, "You've been avoiding the drawing room, Your Grace." "Dorian," he corrected automatically. "And yes, I have. I can only endure so much of Clarissa's pianoforte playing. She's technically proficient, but entirely without feeling. It's like listening to a very accomplished music box." Despite herself, Isolder smiled. "That's unkind, but accurate." He moved into the room, closing the door behind him. "What are you working on?" "Household accounts. Mrs. Wickham's eyesight isn't what it once was, so I help with the books." He came to stand beside her, looking down at the neat columns of figures. "You have beautiful handwriting." "Thank you. My father insisted I be educated properly, even though I was only a daughter. He said ignorance was a prison worse than any made of stone." "Your father was a wise man." Dorian pulled up a chair and sat beside her, closer than propriety allowed. "Tell me about him." And somehow, in that quiet room with only candlelight between them, Isolder found herself talking about things she rarely discussed. She told him about her father's small estate, about how he'd loved books and ideas more than profit, about how her mother had run the household with gentle efficiency. She told him about the garden where she'd played as a child, about the governess who'd taught her French and history and mathematics. She told him about the fever that had come suddenly and taken them both within days, about the confusion and terror of being 12 years old and completely alone. Dorian listened without interruption, his attention absolute. When she finished, he said quietly, "You've lost a great deal. So have many people. I'm not unique in suffering loss." "No, but your losses are uniquely yours, and they deserve to be acknowledged rather than dismissed." He paused. "Do you remember what I told you about my stepfather?" "Yes." "What I didn't tell you was how I survived those years. I survived by making plans. I told myself that when I came into my majority, when I had control of my own life and fortune, I would be different from him. I would be different from most of the men of our class. I would use my position to make things better rather than simply maintaining the status quo." "Have you succeeded?" Isolder asked. "In some ways, I've improved conditions for my tenants, funded schools, supported reform legislation. But in other ways," he trailed off, his expression troubled, "in other ways I've been complicit in the very systems I claim to oppose. I've played the social games. attended the right parties, maintained the right connections. I've compromised more than I'd like to admit. That's not weakness, Your Grace, that's pragmatism. You can't change a system from outside it. Can't I? Or is that just what I tell myself to justify my comfort? He turned to look at her directly. These past days, watching how you're treated in this house, watching how Lady Seraphina and her daughters parade themselves for my approval as if they're goods at market. It's made me angry in a way I haven't been in years. It's reminded me that all my reforms and progressive ideas mean nothing if I'm still participating in a fundamentally unjust social order. What are you saying? I'm saying that meeting you has disrupted something in me. You've reminded me that behind all the titles and social performances, we're all just people trying to find meaning and connection, and you've made me realize that I've been lonely in ways I hadn't let myself acknowledge. The room felt suddenly very small, very quiet. Isolder's pulse hammered in her throat. Your Grace, Dorian, please, just for tonight, call me Dorian. Dorian. His name felt strange and wonderful on her tongue. What you're suggesting, what I think you're suggesting, it's impossible. Why? Because you're a duke and I'm nobody. Because society would never accept it. Because Lady Seraphina would throw me out on the street if she suspected anything between us. Because... Her voice cracked. Because hope is dangerous for people like me. I've survived by not hoping for things I can't have. And what if I told you that you could have them? What if I told you that I have enough power and wealth to disregard society's approval if I choose? Then I'd say you're being reckless and foolish. But even as she said it, Isolder felt something unfurling in her chest, something that felt dangerously like possibility. Dorian reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. His touch was warm, gentle, and it sent electricity through her entire body. Perhaps I am being reckless. Perhaps I'm being foolish. But I've spent 32 years being careful and calculated. And where has it gotten me? I'm wealthy and powerful and utterly alone. I've had women throw themselves at me for my title and fortune, but not one of them has seen me, the actual person beneath the dukedom. Until you. You don't know me, Isolder whispered. We've barely spoken. I know that you're brilliant and strong. I know that you've survived circumstances that would have broken someone weaker. I know that when you speak, you say what you actually think rather than what you think I want to hear. I know that you move through the world with grace and dignity, despite being given every reason to be bitter. His thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. And I know that every time I see you, I want to know more. I want to hear your thoughts on everything. Politics, philosophy, literature, life. I want to make you laugh. I want to understand what makes you who you are. Tears pricked Isolder's eyes. No one had ever spoken to her this way. No one had ever suggested that she was worthy of such attention, such interest. This can't happen. You'll leave after the dinner party, and you'll return to your life, and I'll return to mine. It's better if we stop this now before what? Before we acknowledge that there's something genuine between us. He shifted closer, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. Isolder, I am not a man who acts on impulse. I think through every decision carefully, but I'm also not a man who ignores truth when it's standing right in front of me. And the truth is that I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the moment we met. This is madness, she breathed. Perhaps. But answer me honestly, do you feel nothing? Is this attraction entirely one-sided? She should lie. She should protect herself, protect him from the complications that would arise if she admitted the truth. But after 17 years of carefully controlling every word, every expression, every gesture, Isolder found she couldn't lie. Not to him. Not about this. No, she whispered. It's not one-sided. The smile that spread across Dorian's face was like sunrise breaking through clouds. Then that's all I need to know. He leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to stop him, and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, tentative, a question more than a demand. Isolder had never been kissed before, had never been touched with tenderness rather than indifference. She'd thought herself resigned to a life without such intimacy, had convinced herself she didn't need it. But as Dorian's lips moved against hers, as his hand tangled gently in her hair, Isolder realized how much she'd been starving without knowing it. She kissed him back with all the loneliness and longing she'd suppressed for so many years, and he responded with a low sound that was almost a groan, pulling her closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dorian rested his forehead against hers. "Come with me," he said urgently. "Come back to Ravenshire with me. Not as a servant, not as a dependent, but as—" He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "Marry me, Isolder." She jerked back, staring at him in shock. "What?" "Marry me. I know it's sudden. I know we've only just met. But I also know that what I feel for you is real and significant. I've never proposed to anyone before because I've never met anyone who made me want to. You do. You make me want to build a life, a real life, not just the performance of one." "You can't be serious. You're proposing to me after a handful of conversations and one kiss. I'm proposing to you because, in those few conversations, I've felt more genuine connection than I've felt in my entire life. I'm proposing because when I imagine my future, I want you in it. I'm proposing because—" He took her hands again, his expression fierce and determined. "Because I think we could be happy together. I think we could be partners in the truest sense. I think you could help me be the man I've always wanted to be, and I think I could give you the life you deserve, rather than the one you've been forced to accept." Isolder felt tears streaming down her face. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, to seize this impossible offer with both hands, but another part, the part that had learned caution through hard experience, held her back. "This is a fairy tale, Dorian. It's not real life. In real life, dukes don't marry penniless cousins of country families. In real life, society would shun you, your peers would mock you, and you'd eventually come to resent me for costing you your position. I don't care about society's opinion. You say that now, but you would care eventually. And even if you didn't, what about children? Would you want your heirs to face the whispers and speculation that would follow them because their mother was nobody? Their mother wouldn't be nobody. She'd be the Duchess of Ravenshire, and she'd be brilliant and strong and worthy of respect." He squeezed her hands. "I understand your fears, Isolder. I do. But I'm asking you to be brave. I'm asking you to take a risk on something that could be extraordinary. And if it fails, if you wake up in 6 months and realize you've made a terrible mistake, then I'll have made it with intention rather than indifference, which is more than most people can say about their marriages." His voice softened. "But I don't think I'll regret it. I think I'll spend the rest of my life grateful that I took this chance." Isolder closed her eyes, her mind racing. Everything she knew about the world told her this was impossible, that accepting would lead to disaster. But everything she felt, everything Dorian had awakened in her, whispered that this might be her one opportunity for genuine happiness. "I need time to think," she finally said. "This is too important, too life-altering, for me to decide in a moment of passion." Disappointment flickered across his face, but he nodded. "Of course. Take the time you need. But Isolder—" He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Know that I meant every word. This isn't some impulse I'll reconsider in the morning. Tomorrow at the dinner party, the day after when I'm meant to leave, a month from now, my offer will stand." He left then, slipping out of the study and leaving Isolder alone with the ledgers and the dying candle, and a heart full of confusion and hope and terror. She sat there for a long time, staring at the numbers on the page without seeing them, her lips still tingling from his kiss, her mind spinning through every possible outcome of the impossible choice he'd presented. By the time she finally retreated to her attic room, the house was dark and silent. But Isolder lay awake until dawn, watching shadows play across the ceiling, weighing years of hard-learned caution against the possibility of a different life. The dinner party began at 7 o'clock the following evening, and Isolder had been working since before dawn to ensure everything was perfect. She'd helped cook with the final preparations for the elaborate multi-course meal. She'd supervised the footmen as they set the table with the family's finest china and crystal. She'd arranged flowers in the drawing room and ensured that every candle, every fire, every detail was exactly as Lady Seraphina demanded. As instructed, she remained out of sight once the guests began arriving. From her position in the servants' corridor, she could hear the growing chatter of voices, the rustle of silk gowns, the affected laughter of people performing civility for social advantage. There were perhaps 20 guests in total, various lords and ladies, wealthy merchants hoping to marry into nobility, eligible young men being displayed like prize horses for Clarissa and Vivian's inspection. Mrs. Wickham found her watching through a crack in the door. "You should eat something," the housekeeper said quietly. "It's going to be a long night." "I'm not hungry." Mrs. Wickham studied her with those sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. "You've been distracted today. Actually, you've been distracted for days. It wouldn't have anything to do with a certain duke, would it?" Isolder's head snapped around. "I don't know what you mean." "Child, I've worked in great houses for 40 years. I know when something's developing between two people, no matter how careful they think they're being." The housekeeper's expression wasn't unkind. "He's a good man, His Grace, better than most of his kind. But good doesn't change the facts of the world we live in." "Nothing's developing," Isolder said, the lie tasting bitter. "His Grace has been kind to me, nothing more." "If you say so." Mrs. Wickham didn't sound convinced. "But be careful, dear. Hope can be dangerous when it's misplaced." She left before Isolder could respond, and Isolder was left staring through the crack in the door at the glittering assembly beyond. She could see Dorian now, tall and elegant in his evening clothes, speaking with Lord Greythorne and another gentleman she didn't recognize. He looked every inch the powerful duke, commanding, confident, completely at ease in this world of privilege and performance. How could she have imagined even for a moment that she belonged in that world? How could she have let herself believe his proposal was anything more than a moment of romantic fancy that would dissolve in the harsh light of day? But then, as if sensing her gaze, Dorian turned slightly and looked directly at the servant's door. He couldn't possibly see her in the darkness of the corridor, couldn't possibly know she was there. Yet something in his expression, a softness, a question, made her wonder if he knew anyway. The dinner itself was, by all accounts, a success. Isolder heard the reports from the footmen as they moved between the dining room and the kitchen. The food was excellent, the wine flowed freely, the conversation was lively. Lady Seraphina had positioned Clarissa beside a young viscount who seemed quite taken with her, while Vivian had captured the attention of a wealthy baron's son. But it was the Duke of Ravenshire everyone wanted to speak with, and Isolder wasn't surprised. Power attracted people like moths to flame, and Dorian possessed power in abundance. She imagined him navigating the social currents with practiced skill, saying the right things, making the right impressions, all while maintaining that slight detachment she'd glimpsed in their conversations, the sense of someone observing and analyzing even as he participated. It was nearly 10 o'clock when one of the footmen came hurrying into the kitchen, his expression flustered. "Miss Marin, there's a problem. Lady Seraphina is asking for you specifically." Isolder's stomach dropped. "What sort of problem?" "One of the guests, Lord Hartley, has had some sort of attack. He's having difficulty breathing and his face is swelling. His Grace the Duke suggested it might be a reaction to something in the food and asked if you might know what to do. He said—" The footman paused, looking uncomfortable. "He said you were the most capable person in the household for handling such matters." Isolder didn't hesitate. She grabbed the medical kit they kept in the still room and hurried toward the dining room, propriety forgotten in the face of genuine emergency. When she entered, she found the dinner party in disarray. Most of the guests had drawn back from the table, where a portly man in his 50s sat gasping for air, his face alarmingly red and swollen. Lady Seraphina stood frozen, clearly having no idea what to do. But Dorian was beside the afflicted man, supporting him, his own face calm despite the chaos around them. "Isolder," he said when he saw her, and the relief in his voice was evident. "Lord Hartley seems to be having a severe reaction to something. Can you help?" She moved quickly to the man's side, assessing the situation with the practical knowledge she'd gained from years of helping treat household illnesses and injuries. The swelling, the breathing difficulties, the speed of onset. It looked like what her father's old physician had called an acute sensitivity reaction. "Did the meal include shellfish?" she asked. "There were prawns in the second course," Cook confirmed from the doorway, wringing her hands. "Lord Hartley, have you ever had problems eating shellfish before?" Isolder asked, speaking slowly and clearly. The man managed a jerky nod, his breathing becoming more labored. "We need to help his body purge the reaction," Isolder said, moving into action. She pulled a small vial from her medical kit, an emetic she'd prepared months ago. "This will make you vomit, my lord, which should help, and we need cool compresses for the swelling." She worked quickly and efficiently, issuing calm instructions to the hovering servants. Within minutes, Lord Hartley had indeed been sick, and though the experience was unpleasant, his breathing began to ease almost immediately. The swelling started to recede and colour returned to his face. "Extraordinary," murmured the physician who'd been among the guests, having watched Isolder's treatment with professional interest. "Quick thinking and proper application of medical principles. Where did you study, young woman?" "I didn't study formally, sir. I learned from observation and necessity." "Remarkable." The physician turned to Lord Hartley, who was now breathing normally, though looking exhausted and embarrassed. "You're very fortunate. Without prompt treatment, such reactions can prove fatal." Lord Hartley looked at Isolder with genuine gratitude. "You saved my life, Miss Maren. Isolder Maren." "I'm in your debt, Miss Maren." Lady Seraphina, who had remained uncharacteristically silent during the entire incident, finally found her voice. "Well, how fortunate that Isolder was available. Now perhaps we should all retire to the drawing room for coffee while the staff clears the table." It was a clear dismissal, an attempt to return things to normal and remove Isolder from the guests' attention. But Dorian spoke before Isolder could retreat. "Miss Maren," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "would you join us in the drawing room? I think Lord Hartley would appreciate the opportunity to thank you properly, and I'm certain others would like to know more about your medical knowledge." Lady Seraphina's face went white, then red. "Your Grace, that's very kind, but Isolder has duties to attend to." "I'm certain her duties can wait," Dorian interrupted smoothly. "Lord Greythorn, surely you don't object to having someone so capable join your guests?" Lord Greythorn looked between his wife and the Duke, clearly calculating which alliance was more valuable. "Of course not, Your Grace. Isolder, please join us." And so Isolder found herself still in her simple work dress, following the glittering assembly into the drawing room. She felt acutely out of place among the silk and jewels, but Dorian stayed close to her, his presence a steadying anchor. The evening that followed was surreal. The physician engaged her in a lengthy discussion about herbal remedies and folk medicine, clearly impressed by her knowledge. Several ladies asked about her preparations for various minor ailments. Lord Hartley insisted on learning where she'd acquired her medical kit, so he could commission something similar. Through it all, Dorian remained nearby, occasionally adding to the conversation, but mostly watching Isolder with an expression she couldn't quite read. Clarissa and Vivian looked scandalized and furious, whispering to each other in a corner. Lady Seraphina wore a frozen smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was nearly midnight when the guests finally began departing. Isolder tried to slip away, but Dorian caught her arm gently. "Walk with me," he said quietly. "Just for a moment." They stepped out onto the terrace, the cool night air a relief after the stifling warmth of the drawing room. The garden stretched before them, silver and mysterious in the moonlight. "You were magnificent tonight," Dorian said. "You saved a man's life while everyone else stood frozen in panic, and then you held your own with a room full of people who've spent their entire lives perfecting the art of social performance." "I made a spectacle of myself," Isolder said. "Lady Seraphina will never forgive me. Lady Seraphina is a small-minded woman who's threatened by anyone with more substance than surface. Don't let her narrow view define your worth." He turned to face her fully. "Have you thought about my proposal?" "I've thought of little else." "And?" Isolder took a deep breath, feeling as if she stood on the edge of a precipice. Every instinct screamed caution, safety, the familiar pain of resignation over the terrifying possibility of hope. But tonight had reminded her of something important. She was capable. She was strong. She had value beyond what Lady Seraphina's treatment suggested. Maybe, just maybe, she was also brave enough to reach for something more. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." The joy that transformed Dorian's face was like nothing she'd ever seen. He pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around, laughing with pure delight. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, and Isolder kissed him back, letting herself feel the full force of her own happiness without reservation. "We'll leave tomorrow," Dorian said when they finally broke apart. "I'll speak with Lord Greythorne in the morning, settle things properly. We can be married within the month if we obtain a special license." "Dorian, wait." Isolder pressed a hand to his chest. "We need to be realistic about what this will mean. Society will talk. Your peers will judge you. There will be consequences. Let them talk, let them judge. I have a dukedom to run, reforms to implement, a life to build with you. I don't have time to worry about the opinions of people whose approval I've never particularly wanted." His expression grew serious. "But I need you to understand something, Isolder. This won't be easy. There will be people who treat you poorly because of your background. There will be social events where you're snubbed or excluded. I can shield you from some of that with my position and wealth, but not all of it. I know, but I've spent 17 years being invisible and undervalued. At least with you, I'll be fighting those battles from a position of partnership rather than powerlessness." "Partnership," Dorian repeated softly. "Yes, that's exactly what I want. Not a decorative duchess who simpers and defers, but a true partner who challenges me and stands beside me as an equal. I don't know how to be a duchess. Good, because I want you to redefine what being a duchess means, not conform to some outdated template." He took her hands, his expression tender. "We'll figure it out together, Isolder. All of it. The social navigation, the responsibilities, the inevitable challenges. Together. Together." The word resonated in Isolder's chest like a bell. For 17 years, she'd been alone even in a house full of people. The possibility of genuine partnership, of someone choosing to stand with her rather than tolerating her presence, felt almost too wonderful to believe. They stood together on the terrace for a long time, making plans and dreaming aloud about the future. Dorian told her about Ravenshire, about the estate he loved and the work he hoped to do there. Isolder found herself sharing her own ideas, thoughts about education for tenant children, about improving medical care for rural communities, about creating opportunities for women who, like herself, had few options. "You're going to be an extraordinary duchess," Dorian said. "You're going to change things." "We're going to change things," Isolder corrected. "Partnership, remember?" His smile was radiant. Partnership. The confrontation with Lady Seraphina came the next morning, as Isolder had known it would. She was summoned to the lady's private sitting room, where Seraphina waited with an expression of cold fury. "You've made a fool of this family," Lady Seraphina said without preamble, "throwing yourself at the Duke of Ravenshire, manipulating him with your medical theatrics last night. Did you think I wouldn't notice?" "I didn't throw myself at anyone," Isolder said calmly. "And I didn't manipulate anyone. I treated a medical emergency to the best of my ability. Don't play innocent with me. I saw how he looked at you. I saw you both on the terrace last night." Lady Seraphina's voice rose. "You've been scheming since he arrived, haven't you? Trying to seduce him to escape your proper place." "My proper place," Isolder repeated quietly, "was determined by you 17 years ago, when you decided I was more useful as unpaid labor than as family. I've served this household faithfully and competently since I was 12 years old. I've asked for nothing, complained about nothing, accepted every slight and dismissal without protest. And now, when I have an opportunity for a different life, you call it scheming." "An opportunity? You think the Duke of Ravenshire truly intends to marry you? You're deluded, girl. Men like him don't marry women like you. He'll use you and discard you, and then where will you be? You'll have no place here, I can promise you that. His Grace has asked me to marry him," Isolder said steadily, "and I've accepted. He's speaking with Lord Greythorne this morning to formalize the arrangement." Lady Seraphina's face went through several shades of red and white. "You can't be serious. This is social suicide, for you and for him. Society will never accept you as a duchess. You'll be laughed out of every drawing room in England. Perhaps, but I'd rather face ridicule as the Duchess of Ravenshire than live another day as your invisible servant. After everything I've done for you, I took you in when you had nothing. I gave you a home, food, education. You gave me the attic room and hand-me-down clothes," Isolder interrupted, years of suppressed anger finally breaking free. "You used me as free labor, and made sure I knew every day that I was here on sufferance. You're not angry because I'm making a mistake. You're angry because I'm escaping your control." Lady Serafina drew herself up. "Get out, pack your things, and get out of my house this instant. I won't have an ungrateful, scheming creature under my roof." "I'll be gone by afternoon," Isolder said. She turned toward the door, then paused. "And Serafina? I do thank you for taking me in all those years ago, but I'm not grateful for how you treated me once I arrived. There's a difference between providing charity and providing kindness, and you never understood that." She left before Lady Serafina could respond, her heart pounding but her steps steady. She'd just burned the only bridge she had, severed the only security she'd known for 17 years, but instead of fear she felt something like exhilaration. She was free. Dorian found her in her attic room an hour later, packing her few possessions into the same carpet bag she'd arrived with years ago. He filled the doorway, his presence somehow making the small space feel even smaller. "Lord Greythorn has given his blessing," Dorian said. Well, blessing might be overstating it. He was confused and concerned, but ultimately he couldn't think of a good reason to refuse his permission for you to leave the household. Lady Serafina, I gather, was less diplomatic. She ordered me to leave immediately. Then we'll accommodate her wishes. He moved into the room, taking the carpet bag from her hands and setting it aside. "Isolder, look at me." She looked up into his grey-blue eyes and saw certainty there, solid and unwavering. "Are you afraid?" he asked gently. "Terrified," she admitted. "I'm leaving the only home I've known, marrying a man I've known for barely a week, entering a world I don't understand. Of course I'm afraid." "Good. Fear means you understand the magnitude of what we're doing. But fear doesn't have to be paralyzing. It can be energizing if we use it properly." He cupped her face in his hands. "I'm afraid too, if I'm being honest. I'm afraid I won't be able to protect you from every cruelty society might aim in your direction. I'm afraid I'll fail to live up to your expectations. I'm afraid that my privilege and power won't be enough to build the partnership I've promised." "Then we'll be afraid together," Isolder said, "and we'll be brave together too." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, a promise sealed in the privacy of that small attic room. When they broke apart, he helped her finish packing, treating her meager possessions with the same care he might give his own valuables. They left Alderbury Manor that afternoon with little fanfare. Mrs. Wickham gave Isolder a fierce hug and a package of food for the journey. A few of the other servants wished her well, their expressions showing genuine happiness for her good fortune, mixed with the skepticism of people who'd seen too many promises broken. Clarissa and Vivian watched from an upstairs window, their faces masks of shock and envy. Lady Serafina didn't appear at all. Lord Greythorn saw them off with awkward formality, clearly uncertain how to handle the situation, but too politically savvy to risk offending a duke. As the carriage pulled away, Isolder looked back at the manor one final time. She'd expected to feel sadness or nostalgia, some pang of loss for the only home she'd known since childhood. Instead, she felt only relief and a growing sense of anticipation. "No regrets?" Dorian asked, taking her hand. "None," Isolder said, and meant it. The journey to Ravenshire took 3 days. They travelled in Dorian's well-appointed carriage, stopping at comfortable inns each night. Dorian had arranged for a maid to accompany them for propriety's sake, though the young woman spent most of her time discreetly looking out the window while Dorian and Isolder talked. And talk they did. They talked about everything: politics, philosophy, literature, their childhoods, their hopes and fears. Dorian told her about his work reforming his estates, about the schools he'd funded, and the agricultural innovations he was implementing. He told her about his late grandmother, who'd raised him after his father's death, and taught him that true nobility came from character rather than title. Isolder shared her dreams cautiously at first, then with growing confidence as Dorian listened with genuine interest. She wanted to establish a lending library for tenant families. She wanted to train local women in basic medical care so rural communities wouldn't be helpless when doctors couldn't be reached. She wanted to create opportunities for education and self-improvement for those who'd been denied both by accident of birth. "We'll do all of it," Dorian said, his enthusiasm matching hers. We'll start with the library and the medical training, then expand from there. You'll have whatever resources you need. You make it sound so simple. It won't be simple, but it will be worthwhile, and we'll have each other to lean on when it gets difficult. When they finally arrived at Ravenshire, Isolder's breath caught. The estate was magnificent, a sprawling manor house of golden stone set amid rolling parkland, with formal gardens stretching in every direction. But it wasn't the grandeur that moved her. It was the sense of life and purpose she could feel even from a distance. Workers moved through the grounds with efficient purpose. Smoke rose from cottage chimneys in the village visible beyond the main gates. Everything spoke of a place that was cared for, inhabited, loved. "Welcome home," Dorian said softly as the carriage rolled up the drive. Home. The word settled into Isolder's chest, strange and wonderful. This was to be her home now. Not a place where she was tolerated, but a place where she belonged by right and choice. The staff assembled to greet them showed curiosity, but no judgment. Mrs. Crawford, the housekeeper, was a brisk woman in her 50s who took one look at Isolder's simple travelling dress and said, "We'll need to get you properly outfitted, Your Grace. I'll send for the dressmaker tomorrow." Your Grace. The title still felt surreal, but hearing it spoken matter-of-factly rather than with scorn or disbelief helped make it real. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the private chapel at Ravenshire. They'd obtained a special license, and Dorian had invited only a handful of close friends, people he trusted to welcome Isolder without judgment. It was a small ceremony, intimate and genuine, nothing like the elaborate social spectacles most ducal weddings entailed. Isolder wore a gown of ivory silk, simpler than fashion dictated, but beautiful in its elegant lines. Dorian stood beside her in the chapel, looking at her as if she were something precious and miraculous, and when they exchanged vows, his voice was steady and sure. The kiss that sealed their marriage was tender, but passionate, full of promise. And when they walked out of the chapel into the spring sunshine hand in hand, Isolder felt as if she'd been reborn into a completely new existence. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of adjustment. Isolder had to learn the intricacies of managing a ducal household, which was far more complex than anything she'd done at Alderbury Manor. She had to navigate relationships with the staff, establish her authority without being tyrannical, and balance Dorian's expectations with her own instincts. She also had to face society. Their first major event was a ball at a neighbouring estate, and Isolder was terrified. She wore one of her new gowns, deep emerald silk that brought out the green in her eyes, and stood beside Dorian as they entered the ballroom. The reaction was mixed. Some people were openly curious, approaching to meet the new Duchess of Ravenshire with genuine interest. Others whispered behind fans, their expressions ranging from scandalized to amused. A few cut them directly, turning away with deliberate rudeness when Dorian tried to make introductions. Each snub stung, but Isolder kept her head high and her expression serene. She'd survived 17 years of Lady Seraphina's subtle cruelties. She could survive this. Dorian, for his part, handled the situation with perfect composure. When people were rude, he simply moved on without reaction. When people were welcoming, he thanked them warmly. And throughout the evening, his hand remained at the small of Isolder's back, a constant, steadying presence. "You were magnificent," he told her later as they rode home in their carriage. "Every inch a duchess. I felt like an imposter. That's because you're intelligent enough to understand the arbitrary nature of these social hierarchies. Most people who are born into them never question whether they deserve their position." He pulled her close. "But you earned your place beside me through strength and resilience. That's worth far more than any inherited title." As spring turned to summer, Isolder found her footing. She established her lending library, stocking it with books from Ravenshire's extensive collection and purchasing new volumes to fill in gaps. She began training sessions for local women interested in learning basic medical care, drawing on her own knowledge and consulting with the estate physician to develop a proper curriculum. The tenants and villagers responded with cautious warmth at first, then growing enthusiasm, as they realized the new Duchess was genuinely interested in their welfare. Isolder visited families, listened to their concerns, and worked with Dorian to address problems and implement improvements. She discovered she had a gift for administration and organization, The skills she'd developed managing Alderbury Manor's household translated well to larger-scale projects. More importantly, she found genuine satisfaction in work that made a tangible difference in people's lives. Her relationship with Dorian deepened with each passing day. They were partners in every sense, in bed and out of it, in work and in leisure. They challenged each other intellectually, supported each other emotionally, and built a life together that felt authentic rather than performed. There were difficult moments, of course. Some members of society never accepted Isolder, and their cutting remarks occasionally penetrated her armor. There were times when she felt overwhelmed by the responsibilities of her position, times when she missed the simplicity of her old life, even as she knew she could never go back to it. But whenever she faltered, Dorian was there, and whenever he struggled with the weight of his own obligations, she stood beside him. They were partners, just as he'd promised, and that partnership made them both stronger. 6 months after their wedding, they hosted their first major gathering at Ravenshire, a house party for progressive-minded peers and reformers. Isolder had been nervous about playing hostess on such a scale, but the event was a tremendous success. Guests praised her warmth and intelligence, and several lords approached Dorian afterward to say how fortunate he was to have found such a remarkable duchess. One evening during the party, Isolder stood on the terrace watching the sunset over the gardens she'd helped redesign. She thought about the girl she'd been at Alderbury Manor, invisible, resigned, convinced that modest survival was the best she could hope for. That girl seemed impossibly distant now. In her place stood a woman who had claimed her own power, who had reached for something more and found it. She'd been terrified, had made the leap anyway, and discovered that sometimes courage was rewarded rather than punished. Dorian joined her on the terrace, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" "How far I've come. How different my life is now." "Are you happy?" he asked, echoing that question from months ago in the conservatory. This time, Isolder didn't hesitate. "Yes, genuinely, completely happy." "Good, because I meant what I said that first night. I wanted to make you happy. I wanted to give you the life you deserved." She turned in his arms to face him. "You've given me more than that. You've given me partnership and purpose. You've given me a place where I belong. You've given me love. And you've given me all the same things," Dorian said, kissing her forehead. "You've made me better than I was. You've helped me become the man my grandmother hoped I'd be." They stood together as twilight deepened around them, two people who had found each other against all odds, and built something real and lasting. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy. They both knew that. Society could be cruel, circumstances could be challenging, and life had a way of presenting obstacles when least expected. But they would face it all together. That was the promise they'd made in the chapel, the commitment they renewed every day through action and word. Together they were stronger than either could be alone. Together they could reshape not just their own lives, but the world around them. The stars began to emerge overhead, and music drifted out from the ballroom where their guests were dancing. Dorian extended his hand to Isolder. "Dance with me?" She took his hand, letting him lead her back inside to the warmth and light and music. As they moved together across the floor, Isolder caught her reflection in one of the gilt-framed mirrors that lined the walls. She saw a woman in an elegant gown, jewels at her throat, dancing in the arms of a duke who looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in his world. But more than that, she saw herself, truly herself perhaps for the first time in 17 years. Not invisible, not diminished, not hiding in shadows. Just Isolder, strong and capable and loved, exactly as she was. She'd thought she would always be just another face in the crowd, overlooked and forgotten. She'd resigned herself to a life at the margins, convinced that wanting more was dangerous. But then a duke with grey-blue eyes had looked at her and seen something worth pursuing. He'd offered her a chance at something extraordinary, and she'd been brave enough to take it. Now dancing in the ballroom at Ravenshire, with her husband's arms around her, and her future stretching bright and full of possibility before her, Isolder understood something fundamental. She hadn't been rescued from her old life. She'd been given the tools and support to rescue herself, to claim the life she deserved rather than the one circumstance had handed her. And that, she thought, as Dorian pulled her closer and whispered something that made her laugh, made all the difference. The music swelled, and they danced on into the night, two hearts beating as one, two lives intertwined, two people who had found in each other not just love, but liberation, not just partnership, but purpose. The Duke of Ravenshire and his Duchess rewriting their own story, and in doing so rewriting what was possible for others who dared to hope for something more. Dear listeners, thank you so much for joining us on Isolder and Dorian's journey from invisible existence to extraordinary love. If this story touched your heart, we would be so grateful if you could take a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and give this video a like. Don't forget to activate the notification bell so you never miss a new romance story from Echoes of Romance. Your support means everything to us and helps us continue bringing you tales of hope, courage, and love that transcends all boundaries. Until next time, may you always have the courage to reach for your own extraordinary happiness.